Ever find yourself just fascinated by someone, maybe even a bit shocked, and you just feel like you have to understand what makes them tick?
Yeah, we all have those people, historical figures, cultural icons who just grab you.
Totally.
Hmm.
And today, we're diving into one of those really magnetic, complex figures, Lenny Bruce.
Ah, Lenny and Bruce. Yeah.
A comedian, but I mean, so much more than that. He seems to live right out there on the edge.
It's pretty compelling how he still resonates, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, beyond the comedy routines, beyond the legal battles, there's a real chance here to understand the deeper stuff driving him.
Okay, so we're not just doing like a history lesson, a recap of his jokes and court dates. We're going deeper.
Exactly. We're using this really interesting essay today that looks at Lenny Bruce through the lens of the Enneagram.
The Enneagram, right?
Specifically, it identifies him as a very vivid example of the sexual 7 personality type.
The sexual set. Okay, that name itself has a certain energy, but this isn't just about labeling him, is it? Putting him in a box.
No, not at all. That's not the goal. The idea is to use this framework, this sexual 7 type, to really get under the skin of how someone like Bruce operated.
Sure.
You want to explore, what was so compelling about him, but also the aspects that, well, ultimately led to a really difficult life and, frankly, a tragic end. It's about understanding those core motivations, those patterns.
All right, let's get into it then. The core of this sexual 7 type, what's the main engine? What drives it?
So the basic drive for any Enneagram Type 7 is this real hunger for stimulation, for exciting experiences, and crucially, a strong desire to avoid pain, negativity, boredom, anything unpleasant.
Okay, the pleasure seeker avoids pain.
Got it. Right. Now, the sexual subtype, and remember, sexual here isn't just about romance, it's about intensity, chemistry, impact. It really amplifies that drive.
Amplifies how?
Their focus sharpens onto a kind of seduction. Again, not always romantic seduction, but seducing attention, captivating people, making a big splash, having an impact.
So it's like the volume is cranked way up on that standard type 7 need for fun and avoiding the bad stuff.
Exactly. Turn up to 11. And this intensity, it shows up in some key traits. You often see a degree of narcissism.
Okay.
A real need for exhibitionism, needing to be seen, to be noticed, sometimes what looks like histrionics, maybe big emotional displays, and often just this constant talk, a huge verbal energy, plus a mind that just races, jumping from one idea to the next. It creates this really dynamic, often captivating presence.
Which sounds exactly like Lenny Bruce. That leads us right to his, legendary talkativeness. His monologues weren't exactly short and sweet.
No, definitely not. And interestingly, this essay calls it verbal incontinence. It wasn't just a stage act, it seems.
You think it was just part of who he was?
It seems that way, like his thoughts just had to pour out nonstop. It makes you wonder, how did that constant need to talk shape his comedy, his life?
And it wasn't like, set up, punchline. He wasn't doing tight 5-minute sets. I remember reading he hated the idea of a polished act.
That's a really key point. His biographer, Albert Goldman, said it perfectly. He said, Bruce worshipped the gods of spontaneity, candor, and free association, and that his greatest fear was getting his act down pat.
So he actively fought against being predictable.
Yes. That fear is very telling, isn't it? This constant talking, this free associating, it probably served as a release, a way to let off internal steam, maybe keep anxiety from creeping in.
Like if you keep talking, you don't have to sit with uncomfortable feelings.
Possibly. The very act of generating stuff, constantly making connections, might have been a way to avoid stillness, avoid whatever discomfort that might bring.
Okay, let's talk about that need to be performing, the exhibitionism. The essay calls it an existential need. That sounds pretty deep.
It is. For the sexual 7, according to this model, getting attention isn't just vanity. It's fundamental. It's like they need it to feel real, to feel alive.
They have to be center stage.
Pretty much. In all areas of life, not just their job, if they even have a conventional one.
And you definitely saw that with Bruce. It wasn't just the comedy clubs.
No way.
His legal troubles, the media frenzy around him, even his personal life seemed to be lived out loud. Very publicly.
Exactly. And his methods for getting that attention fit the sexual 7 pattern perfectly. Deliberately provoking people, smashing taboos, constantly being defiant. I mean, think about that naked protest in Los Angeles he did against the obscenity charges.
Right. Yeah.
That's pretty extreme exhibitionism, isn't it?
Yeah.
A very dramatic, controversial way to grab the spotlight and make a statement.
And that defiance, it feels linked to what the essay calls his art of impertinence. It really does seem like challenging authority was just core to him.
Absolutely. Impertinence wasn't just a comedy technique for Bruce. It seems like it was baked into his personality.
Like his default setting.
Almost. His whole career felt like one long challenge to the establishment, to social rules, to what you were supposed to say or do. He wasn't just pushing boundaries. He seemed to actively look for ways to stick it to the man, so to speak.
That story about Barbara Wyndon in Sydney. He walks on stage. She apparently says something judgmental.
Right, and his immediate response is just, "Fuck you, madam." That's different, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, talk about direct.
Exactly. It wasn't calculated for laughs necessarily. It felt like this raw, immediate pushback against perceived judgment. Just asserting his view, zero filter, zero concern for niceties or consequences.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, the essay also talks about magical thinking and denial. That sounds maybe less positive.
It's an interesting aspect. The idea is that the sexual seven can have this intense optimism that sometimes crosses the line. They might think they can charm or talk their way out of anything.
Like reality doesn't quite apply?
Or that things will just magically work out. How do you think that plays out when things get really serious, like legally serious?
Well, the essay points to Bruce representing himself in court, right?
Yeah.
Even after losing again and again.
Exactly.
As like he truly believed his sheer personality, his words, could just overcome the legal system. That feels like a disconnect.
It really does. And apparently this optimism, or perhaps denial, continued even when clubs were banning him left and right. Paul Krasner said his optimism bordered on pathological denial.
Wow. Pathological denial.
Yeah, it suggests a real struggle, maybe an inability to fully face how bad things had gotten.
This focus on himself, his own perspective, seems to tie into the next point. Self-referentiality and narcissism in his work.
Yeah.
Everything became material for him.
Yes, that's a key trait of the sexual seven, turning personal experience into attention-grabbing stories. And for Bruce, wow, the line between his life and his art just seemed to vanish.
Completely blurred.
His arrests, his messy divorce, his drug problems, it all went straight into the act.
It's like he was living his life so he could talk about it on stage. Or talking about it was his way of living it.
Maybe both.
Yeah.
Goldman, the biographer again, said that for Bruce, the distinction between his life and his art had become completely academic. And you have to consider maybe turning his life into a narrative, a performance, was also a defense, a way to process painful stuff or even distance himself by making it a show for others.
Interesting angle. Okay, then there's impulsivity and the need for instant gratification. That definitely tracks with the intensity we've been talking about.
Oh, absolutely. The sexual seven, according to the model, often has a really low tolerance for frustration. They want things now.
And Bruce's life story is full of examples, isn't it?
Totally. Quick marriages, that really disturbing incident where he essentially kidnapped his own daughter.
Right, I remember reading about that.
Sudden career shifts, and of course the drug addiction, which is often linked to seeking immediate relief or sensation.
Mort Sell nailed it, didn't he? He said, Lenny couldn't wait for absolutely anything. Everything had to be immediate.
That paints such a clear picture. It's this underlying impatience, this difficulty just sitting with discomfort or waiting for things. Impulsivity becomes the go-to, seeking that immediate hit of stimulation to avoid boredom or unease.
The essay also mentions rejecting authority and responsibility. Calls it anti-hierarchical escapism. How did that show up?
Well, we saw it constantly in his challenging of structures, right? He never really had a normal job.
No 9 to 5 for Lenny.
Definitely not. Seemed to avoid stable commitments, often relied on others for practical things, and his refusal to censor himself, even with cops literally in the room.
Yeah, that takes some guts.
Yeah.
Or something else.
It's a powerful example of resisting external limits. It wasn't just about free speech as a principle. It seemed like an inherent inability or maybe unwillingness to submit to anyone telling him what to do.
So he's very much marching to his own drum. But then the essay brings up selfishness masked by pseudo-empathy.
That sounds complicated.
It is. It's a subtle point. The idea is that while a sexual seven can genuinely show understanding and even fight for causes...
Like Bruce did for civil rights and free speech. He was passionate about that stuff.
Absolutely, and that's important. But the theory suggests their primary focus often loops back to their own needs, their own desires. So the empathy might be real, but self-interest is still driving the bus.
Something like that. In his public life, he championed these big ideas. But in his personal relationships, particularly with his wife Honey Harlow and his daughter Kitty, there seemed to be a real self-centeredness at times.
The stories about the alleged marijuana report involving his daughter and the kidnapping, Those definitely suggest his needs came first sometimes.
Exactly. So while he could connect with broad social issues, his personal actions sometimes showed him prioritizing his own immediate world, maybe at the expense of people close to him.
And this persona, this constant performance mode, it leads to the idea that the sexual seven finds it hard to drop the act. Humor as a shield.
Precisely. For this type, humor is often the main way they relate to the world. It's a way to keep things light, maybe, but also a way to keep vulnerability at bay.
Even when he was dead serious about free speech, there was always that layer of irony, wasn't there? That comedian's edge.
Always. Ralph J. Gleason observed that even in his most vulnerable moments, there was a layer of irony that kept the real Lenny at a distance.
That's so insightful. It suggests it was hard for him to just be open, raw, unguarded.
Yeah, and that reliance on humor, on the performance as a shield, it can get in the way of real connection. It can make it hard for them and for others to see the pain that might be underneath it all.
Which, tragically, leads to the breakdown. The essay argues these coping mechanisms just stopped working for him eventually.
Yeah, Bruce's life really becomes a kind of stark example of where an unintegrated sexual seven path can lead, self-destruction.
Initially, the humor, the talking, maybe the drugs, it worked, gave him relief.
It might have provided temporary relief, yeah. A way to manage the internal pressure. But as the external pressures ramped up the bans, the legal fees, the isolation, and those strategies just weren't enough anymore. They started to fail him.
And then the overdose.
Yeah.
Dead at 40. Just brutal.
So young. Dick Sheep's eulogy. It was so blunt. One last four-letter word for Lenny. Dead. At 40. That's obscene.
Yeah. It just captures the weight, the tragedy of it all.
It really highlights the potential consequences when these personality patterns taken to an extreme, where that relentless drive for stimulation and escape from pain leads down a really dark road.
So pulling it together, the essay's argument is that Lenny Bruce wasn't just, a uniquely talented, troubled guy. He was almost a textbook case of this sexual seven Enneagram type.
Exactly. A very pure, very intense example. His incredible verbal skill, that magnetism, the exhibitionism, the challenging authority, the magical thinking mixed with the denial, the impulsivity, it all lines up remarkably well with the description of the sexual seven.
And his legacy isn't just about comedy, the essay suggests, precisely because he embodied this archetype so fully. He showed us both sides of it.
Right, the highs and the lows. You see the brilliance, the creativity, the courage to question everything, the really positive potential of the sexual seven energy.
Yeah.
But you also see the shadow side played out so tragically. The addiction, the denial, the ultimate self-destruction. George Carlin said, Lenny was the first to live on stage what the rest of us barely dared to think.
Great quote.
It speaks to his huge impact, right? But viewing it through this Enneagram lens, it also hints at the sheer intensity, maybe even the inherent instability of living that way, embodying that type so completely.
So, wrapping up this deep dive into Lenny Bruce and the sexual seven, we see this incredibly complex person, driven by this core need for excitement, for stimulation, terrified of pain and boredom, and all of it amplified by this intense desire for attention, for impact.
And what's useful about this framework, I think, is how it lets us move past just judging him, admiring him or condemning him. It gives us a way to understand the psychological engine that might have been running underneath it all.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think, how could understanding these kinds of patterns, not just in famous people like Bruce, but maybe in people we know or even ourselves, help us make sense of folks, especially those complex people who shape our culture? And how do we grapple with that line between, brilliance and self-destruction that seems so clear in someone like him?
It leaves you with a really interesting question to ponder, doesn't it? Where might you see echoes of these patterns? The intense search for stimulation, the avoidance of discomfort, the need for attention, the rebellion in your own world. Maybe subtly, maybe not so subtly.
Yeah.
And of course, for anyone whose interest is piqued, there's a ton more to explore, both about the Enneagram itself and, naturally, about the life and work of Lenny Bruce. Lots to dig into.